We started class today by reviewing some of the stories that we read in Tales of Ancient Egypt. I'm not going to take the time to go over those now, but I would like to go over the plot structure diagram that we did in class. You were asked to do one for the Taking of Joppa. And we see that the main conflict in the Taking of Joppa was the conflict between Tuti, who was the royal companion and the general who was sent to try and put down the rebellion of the city of Joppa, and the governor of Joppa. This week we're going to transition from Tales of Ancient Egypt to Greek mythology. And so we discussed in class that the word myth comes from the Greek word mythos, which means to tell a story. Myths are very old stories which were passed on by the spoken word, and so that's why there are so many different versions of the stories. We discussed in class, for example, that in the story of the kidnapping of Helen of Troy, in some versions, Helen is tricked by Prince Paris. He is able to pretend to be her husband, he lures her to the boat, and he kidnaps her, and she never wanted to be with him. However, in other versions of the story, she falls madly in love with him and goes willingly. And in still other versions of the story, she has a magic spell put on her by the goddess Aphrodite, and eventually that spell wears off. And so when people tell stories verbally, each storyteller ends up putting their own spin on the story. We also discussed that myths differ from folk tales and legends. Myths are stories with a message, and they are usually told to explain how something began or why something behaves the way that it does. A myth explains how life started or explains natural events. A myth involves some supernatural power, and a myth is not about a real event. So in our homework packet this week, we had this flow chart, how to tell the difference between a folk tale, a legend, and a myth. And we started with the question, after we've read a story, does it explain the beginning of things? And if yes, then we go to that side of the chart and ask ourselves, does it explain events in nature? Is it a fun animal story? And if it's a fun animal story, then we know that it's a folk tale. And if it is not a fun animal story, then we know that it's a myth. And we discussed the fact that there's a rich tradition in Africa of these folk tales. How the mosquito got its buzz, how the bee got its wings, just a rich tradition of stories about how things began that are just folk tales. Nobody worships a god or a goddess because of these stories. On the other side of the chart, going back up to the top, does it explain the beginning of things? If the answer is no, could it be partly true? We have many legends about Johnny Appleseed. He was an actual person. So if yes, then we know that this person may have lived and it's a legend rather than a myth. If the answer is no, we ask ourselves, does it have an important message for people? And if the answer is still no, then it's probably a legend. But if the answer is yes, then it is a myth. We read together the myth of Apollo and Hyacinthus. Apollo was passionately fond of a youth named Hyacinthus. He accompanied him in his sports, carried the nets when he went fishing, led the dogs when he went to hunt, followed him in his outings in the mountains, and neglected for him his lyre and his arrows. And I stopped here and explained to the class that Apollo was the Greek god of music and of prophecy. He was the brother of Artemis, the huntress, and so he enjoyed hunting also, and he was known for playing his lyre and being a wonderful musician. As the god of prophecy, it was him that people prayed to in order to receive prophecies in the Greek mystery religions. He once fell in love with the daughter of King Priam of Troy. Her name was Cassandra. And when Cassandra rejected his attentions, he gave her the gift of prophecy, and he made her 100% accurate. However, he cursed her, and the curse was that no one would ever believe her prophecies. And I've often thought that after so many prophecies of hers came true, how in the world did people not believe her? I imagine them sitting around a table. You know, the last 200 times Cassandra has been right with her prophecies, but I just don't believe her this time. So, Apollo was fond of Hyacinthus. He is neglecting his lyre. He's neglecting his arrows. He's not going hunting, in other words. And he's following Hyacinthus every place he goes. Oh, you're going to play some sports today? I'll go with you, Hyacinthus. Let me carry your nets. Are you going fishing? Oh, are you going hunting? Let me go get the dogs for you, Hyacinthus. And so we go on with the story. One day they played a game of quoits together. And I stopped here to explain that quoits was a game that it was like a ring toss game. The quoits were very heavy, made of metal, and they tried to get it around a ring. It would be similar today to playing horseshoes. And so they were playing a game of quoits together. And Apollo, heaving aloft the discus, with strength mingled with skill, sent it high and far. Hyacinthus watched it as it flew, and excited with the sport, ran forward to seize it, eager to make his own throw. When the quoit bounced back up from the earth and struck him in the forehead, he fainted and fell. The god, as pale as the boy, raised him and tried all his art to staunch the wound. In other words, he's trying to stop it from bleeding, and to retain the fleeting life, but all in vain. The hurt was past the power of medicine, as when one has broken the stem of a lily in the garden, it hangs its head and turns its flowers to the earth. So the head of the dying boy, as if too heavy for his neck, fell over on his shoulder. "You're dying, Hyacinthus," spoke Apollo, "robbed of your youth by me. Yours is the suffering, mine the crime. Would that I could die for you, but since that may not be, you shall live with me in memory and in song. My lyre shall celebrate you, my song shall tell your fate, and you shall become a flower inscribed with my regrets." While Apollo spoke, behold, the blood which had flowed on the ground and stained the herbage ceased to be blood, but a flower of hue more beautiful than Tyrian sprang up, resembling a lily. Tyrian is a color purple. The ancient people found it difficult to dye things purple. If you take a plant that is purple and try to use it as a dye, it ends up often becoming an ugly shade of brown. And so it was the Phoenicians who figured out that there was a certain kind of snail that they could crush and it would make a beautiful purple dye. And so I just wanted to stop and show that to you. But a flower of hue more beautiful than the Tyrian sprang up, resembling the lily, if it were not that this is purple and that silvery white. In other words, the lily is white, and the new flower was this beautiful purple color. And this was not enough for Apollo, but to bestow still greater honor, he marked the petals with his sorrow, and he inscribed "Ah, ah" upon them, as we see to this day. The flower bears the name of Hyacinthus, and with every returning spring, it revives the memory of his fate. And so, scholars believe that it's not the modern-day hyacinth, but it must have been a different flower that had markings on it that were similar to a particular Greek letter that would have stood for someone saying, "Ah, ah." So we go back to the chart, and we've read the story, and does it explain the beginning of things? Yes, it does. It explains how a hyacinth came to be. According to the story, at one point in Earth's history, there was no flower called a hyacinth. It did not exist, and suddenly it sprang up. It's not about the origin of the name, it's about the origin of the actual plant. Does it explain events in nature? Yes, it does. Is it a fun animal story? No, it is not. So therefore, according to the chart, the story of Apollo and Hyacinthus is a myth. We took some time to go over the Greek god family tree. This is one of your handouts, and it should help you as you start reading the book Heroes, Gods, and Monsters of the Greek Myths this week. A few things I wanted to point out on the chart that aren't covered in the book that you'll be reading is that according to Greek mythology, Gaia came out of chaos. She just sprang out of chaos. Of course, Gaia is the personification of the earth. According to some mythologies, Gaia sprang out, as did Uranus. In English, we'd call him Uranus, but in Greek, they called him Uranus, and so that's what I'm going to do for the purposes of this class. So Gaia sprang forth, she was the earth. Uranus sprang forth, he was the heavens. The mountains sprang forth, and the ocean sprang forth. All of these things sprang forth out of chaos. According to other mythologies, Gaia sprang forth, and then she gave birth to Uranus, the mountains, and the ocean. Either way, she ended up marrying Uranus, and they together had the 100-handed ones, which you'll be reading about in the book this next week. The 100-handed ones were these giant creatures. Each one of them had 3 heads, and each one of them had 100 arms and 100 hands. They also had the Cyclopses, the giants that had the one eye. Don't get those confused with later sons of Poseidon, who also were Cyclopses. And finally, they had the Titans together. Now, according to the mythology, Uranus was not a good father. He didn't like any of his children. He thought the 100-handed ones and the Cyclopses were horribly ugly, and he buried them deep inside Gaia, deep inside the earth, which was very painful to her. And the Titans had a similar fate. Gaia eventually was able to convince one of the Titans to overthrow her husband. Kronos ended up, in some versions of the story, he chopped pieces of Uranus's body off, and Uranus ran away. In other versions of the story, he actually killed Uranus. And from the blood that fell into the ocean, Aphrodite sprang forth. She's Uranus's daughter, but not Gaia's daughter. And in his parting, or in his dying, Uranus curses Kronos to have the same fate that he did. One of your sons will overthrow you, just like you overthrew me. Of course, we know that ended up being Zeus, and you'll be reading about that this week. Another thing that I wanted to point out on the family tree was the origin of nymphs, because the book doesn't really explain that, but then it talks about nymphs. According to Greek mythology, Zeus married the Titaness Themis, and together they are the ones who had the nymphs. There are several different kinds of nymphs. There are Oreads, who are nymphs of the mountain. There are Dryads, who are nymphs of the woods. There are Naiads, which I think are nymphs of fresh water, and Nereids, which were nymphs of ocean water. I also wanted to point out where Mount Olympus is. In Greece, because that will be mentioned several times. Remember that Mount Olympus is where they believed that where the gods lived. I also wanted to show you where Attica was. They'll be mentioning Attica this week. And where Arcadia is. The thing I want you to notice about Attica is that it is bounded on 3 sides by water, so it is very much an ocean culture. Arcadia was more land-bound. I also wanted to point out where Athens is, right on the water. And so when you read about Poseidon and Athena fighting over Athens, you'll know why Poseidon was even interested in the city. Finally, we discussed the writing assignment for this week. Mrs. Griffin asked the class to compare and contrast 2 of the characters that we are going to be reading about this week. I pointed out to the class that there would be a lot of characters that they could compare and contrast. For example, you could compare and contrast Zeus and Hera, the husband and the wife. Or you could compare and contrast Apollo and Artemis, the brother and the sister. You could compare Zeus with one of his brothers, Zeus with Poseidon or Zeus with Hades, or you could compare Poseidon and Hades for that matter. And I went ahead and added to your homework one of the cluster diagrams that we used in class last year. I put it in there just as a way to help you all organize your thoughts. And because so many of the people in the class weren't in class last year, I went ahead and went over how you could use a cluster diagram to approach a compare and contrast essay. Mrs. Griffin is not requiring you to use the cluster diagram, so you don't have to do that, but you can if you want to. Also, I said if you do use the cluster diagram and turn it in with your homework next week, I will give you extra credit on my homework. So I walked the class through comparing and contrasting 2 characters from the reading from the past 2 weeks. And I decided to compare and contrast Sinuhe and Tuti because they were both royal companions. We'll put Sinuhe on one side and Tuti on the other side. And the first thing that occurred to me about Sinuhe was that he was disloyal. Even though he was a royal companion, he plotted against Sen-Usert's father, and so that was a disloyalty, and he realized that he was disloyal, and I think that's why he ran away. Meanwhile, Tuti was very loyal. He also was involved in a plot, but he was plotting against his pharaoh, Thutmose's enemy, who was, of course, the governor of Joppa. The next thing that occurred to me about Sinuhe was that he left Egypt to run away from possible punishment. Meanwhile, Tuti left Egypt at Thutmose's command and to stop the cities from revolting. So these are 2 examples of contrasts. I also noticed that there were things that were alike about them. For example, Sinuhe was a brave and a good general. He won a lot of battles. And Tuti also was a brave and a good general. He also won a lot of battles. And there was one other thing, so I'm going to go ahead and add a couple of more circles there. Both of them returned to Egypt. Remember that Sinuhe returned sort of as a beggar. He's an old man. He wants to come back. He wants to die in Egypt. He doesn't want to die in the kingdom of Retinue. Meanwhile, Tuti returned to Egypt as a victorious general, and he's given high honors because of that. And so that is a good review of what we did in class. I hope this was helpful.